In the 20th century, a handful of cities became legendary. Art, culture, and life itself burned brighter there, flamed by a tolerance that allowed eroticism, permissiveness, and sin to flourish. And for a time in the 20s and 30s, there was one place known as the wickedest city in the world. It was Shanghai.
I'm in dear old Shanghai, and I'm dancing, sweetheart, with you.
Shanghai. Its very name evoked a sense of the exotic, of danger and depravity. For the Chinese, Shanghai meant openness and modernity, the Paris of Asia. For tourists, Shanghai was the whore of the East.
Shanghai acquired a reputation for being a city of sin. It was a supermarket of pleasure, not to speak of the drugs and other diversions you wanted along the way. You could get anything in Shanghai, anything for money.
In the 20s and 30s, the sheer number of prostitutes, gamblers, and drug dealers who flourished in this city surpassed anything seen in other sin cities like Paris or Berlin. It was the standard port of call for adventurers from around the world.
People came on cruises to Shanghai. It was so famous. It was an absolute place you had to stop. And people heard that you could get drugs on room service, that the sex was amazing, that there was extraordinary brothels where you could have Chinese girls, you could have Russian tarts, Eurasians. So it just offered everything that you weren't allowed to do in your ordinary life.
Annually, thousands of visitors came to sample the offerings of this, the world's most notorious port city. For some, like the legendary adventurer and journalist Emily Hahn, Shanghai allowed her to taste the forbidden.
My mother told me that she had always wanted to be an opium addict since she was a child. I have no idea where she got the idea, but she thought it was incredibly romantic. She wanted to experience it. So when she went to Shanghai, she said she smelled it in the streets without realizing what it was. And she told me that opium made her have the most beautiful dreams.
In this city, everything was possible. Everything was for sale. Everything except, perhaps, power. For in this city in China, it was not the Chinese who could claim to be masters in their own home. It was the foreigners. Foreigners could live a life of opulence and ease, oblivious to all that was around them, sheltered in a protective cocoon constructed of money and status.
It was a very lively and intense kind of life. My parents belonged to the Cercle Sportif Français, which was probably the best club in the Far East, if I'm without being too arrogant about it. Magnificent swimming pool, 180-foot swimming pool, 180 feet, can you imagine? Bowling alleys, I think 12 tennis courts, right in the heart of the city. Just a magnificent place.
The Cercle Sportif Français was one of the few private clubs that allowed Chinese to join. And largely because of that policy, the club and its members were widely looked down upon by the city's most powerful group, the British. For this cosmopolitan giant of Asia was by and large built by the British, and the opium from India that they forced China to take in exchange for the Chinese tea and silk. It was the victorious British who, after humiliating the Chinese in the Opium Wars of the mid-1800s, demanded the right to rule over bits and pieces of China. One of those pieces was a parcel of land along the Huangpu River.
And within this city of 3.5 million Chinese was another city, the foreign settlement, made up of the French concession and the well-known international settlement.
Shanghai had become a spoil of war, a treaty port. And as a treaty port, what was good for the British was equally good for the other great powers. They cut out sections of the city and made them their own. The foreigners brought with them their own military, their own courts, their own police, even their own architecture. Depending on the section, different streets of Shanghai looked as if they were plucked from New York, Tokyo, and Paris. The French concession and the British-dominated international settlement were melting pots. Italians, Germans, Portuguese, Swiss, and Brazilians, more than 50 different nationalities, living side by side with the Chinese.
There was definitely a social structure where the British, the American, and the French were the top. They were the masters, they were the lords, they were the powerful ones. And then came the Germans, who had lost World War I. Then you had the mixed bloods. Then you had the Chinese.
The British tended, of course, to have colonial attitudes towards the Chinese. They tended to despise them in some cases. They tended to look down on them. Some of them learned Chinese. Some of them became experts on Chinese culture. Not most of them. Most of the British businessmen went out only for a few years, didn't bother to learn Chinese, and in some cases treated them rather badly.
For many Shanghailanders, as they proudly called themselves, the lives of the poorest of Shanghai were simply too far removed from their own existence. It was as if they had built up an immunity to all that they saw as ugly and squalid.
I used to go to a gymnasium. I would have to step over in the 10 blocks, probably 10 or 20 bodies that went out in the night and just died. This is early in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning. You'd see the cart coming along, and they just chuck the bodies into the thing and take them off to I don't know where.
And during the worst periods in Shanghai, it was recorded that some 30,000 bodies were picked up annually from its streets. Despite all that, Shanghai remained a magnet to millions of desperate peasants fleeing famine and natural disasters. Shanghai meant opportunity in the most modern city in China. But for thousands of women, more often really just girls, Shanghai offered work in the world's oldest profession.
Even in the 19th century, Shanghai was famous for its courtesans. Women came to Shanghai. They found themselves in this cauldron of temptation, a huge vice industry.
In this city of over 3 million, there were about 100,000 prostitutes plying their trade. At the very bottom were the waterfront nail sheds. There were the pheasants or wild chickens who plied their trade on the streets of Shanghai. Then there were the taxi dancers who were prepared to offer a little something more intimate than the 3 dances for $1. And at the very top were the sing-song girls. But the most highly valued of all were the first-night virgins.
And the Chinese brothels were quite extraordinary because they would, these very young girls of 12 and 13, that's what Chinese men liked at that time. And the center of excitement was not a beautiful face, was not their bosoms or their bottom or whatever, it was their feet. And they had these tiny bound feet of about 3 inches, which is excruciatingly painful. You had to bind a little girl's foot from the age of 6 or 7. But this is what the Chinese men loved, and they just liked playing around with these feet, and I don't think I better go into the details of what they did with those feet, but that's what they enjoyed.
From the early days, when there was a ratio of 1 woman for every 10 men, prostitution was common and tolerated.
The French concession had only the second-class prostitutes. They were cheaply affordable for $5 or $10. $10 guarantee a disease-free intercourse, whereas $5 could be a bit risky. But it was the British concession where the most expensive prostitutes were.
While the international settlement might have had the highest-priced prostitutes, it was the French concession, known by the locals as Frenchtown, where the highest-class brothels could be found. Frenchtown with its villas, tree-lined streets, its boutiques, cafes, and nightclubs, was the chic and sophisticated place to live.
One of the misconceptions about the French concession is that it was full of Frenchmen. In fact, the French were a minority in their own concession. There were no more than 2,000 or 3,000 Frenchmen. But other foreigners also liked to live in the French concession.
Along with some 30,000 foreigners, Frenchtown was home for more than 1 million Chinese. And scattered throughout this teeming concession were scores of opium dens, flourishing under the not-so-watchful eyes of the French officials.
The city was honeycombed with stashes of opium, literally. When you went to a casino, opium pipes were provided. When you went to many people's houses, that was part of the hospitality that was extended.
Opium was permissible. It's almost like cigarette in our household. I mean, each time when a guest comes, we would offer a cigarette. For some guests, my father would offer opium.
The opium dens, along with the countless casinos and brothels in the French concession, were run by a Chinese secret criminal society known as the Green Gang.
There was a constant sense on the part of the French that they were living on top of a seething cauldron of a huge mass of Chinese whom they had no way of controlling. But one way they decided they would control it was by, if you like, farming out their police problems to those people who were more experienced with dealing with the underworld. And who was better experienced in dealing with the underworld than a member of that domain himself.
Wan Jingrong, whose nickname was Pockmarked Wang, ran the Green Gang. He was also a French concession police detective.
As a result, the French ended up by having their chief detective become the leading racketeer of the French concession and the leading policeman of the French concession. In Shanghai, police and gangsters are one and the same.
Pockmarked Wang took under his wing a young street-savvy hustler named Du Yusheng. He too had a nickname.
He had very large ears, and the Chinese often said that large ears are a sign of future success. But his ears were so large that he got the moniker Big Ear Du.
It didn't take long for Big Ears Du to move up the criminal ladder.
Shanghai had many criminal organizations, such as thieves and burglars. Du had connections with all of them. For example, if his friend's luggage was stolen when arriving in Shanghai, Du could quickly locate the groups responsible for the theft and get the stolen goods back.
He controlled all of organized crime in Shanghai. He controlled the pickpockets, he controlled the burglars, he controlled all the gambling houses. He controlled all the vice in Shanghai. Above all, he controlled the opium trade.
Big Ears Du became the godfather of crime in Shanghai, and the money from gambling, prostitution, drug trafficking, and protection rackets just kept pouring into the coffers of the Green Gang. In the late 20s and early 30s, it was estimated that 1/3 of China's entire income was under the control of Big Ears Du.
One word from Du Yusan, and you were dead. People who accumulated huge debts in the gambling houses knew that sooner or later, if they didn't pay up, a coffin, a very shiny coffin, would arrive at their house. You could expect to have your kneecaps broken. You could expect to have your hands chopped off. You could expect a lot of pain.
One of the deadly punishments was nicknamed planting the lotus. The violator was put into a huge bag together with a big rock. The bag was then planted into the Shanghai harbor.
The equivalent of kneecapping in Shanghai was tendon cutting. The gangsters would take their victim and cut every available tendon, including the tendon under the tongue, behind the knees, of course the Achilles tendon, which left you just a kind of hopeless bag of jelly left on your front lawn to remind people not to cross the gangs. It was a terrifying punishment.
By the 1920s, Shanghai was the most gangster-ridden metropolis in the world, perhaps because it was also one of the world's richest cities. Shanghai, with its unalloyed passion for making money and its open-door policy, continued to attract an extraordinary collection of misfits, adventurers, revolutionaries, and dreamers. If there was one place that best illustrated what Shanghai had become, it was an establishment called the Great World. Once an emporium of family entertainment, it became a notorious night spot after being taken over by Shanghai's top detective and gangster, Pockmarked Wong.
The Great World was a pleasure palace. And as you made your way up, the girls, there were these gorgeous sort of hostesses walking around trying to help you spend your money. And at the bottom, they were wearing cheongsams just split up to the leg. On the sort of middle floor, their cheongsams were split up to the waist, and by the top floor, they were split up to their armpits. And at the top floor, there was a little sort of gap where people who'd got too overexcited and spent all their money stepped off and killed themselves.
Among the Chinese, Shanghai gained the reputation as a city full of suicides. But for foreigners, this was a city full of life.
It was a fabulous life, really fabulous. Everybody had 4, 5, 6 servants. My mother'd get up and the cook would make breakfast, and we'd all eat breakfast together. And then the chauffeur would drive my father to the office on the Bund. Then he'd come back and he'd pick my mother up, take her to the American Women's Club, and they'd play bridge all day.
For many Shanghailander women, life revolved around their social clubs, where they could while the day away with their tennis, horseback riding, and mahjong. Pink gins in the afternoon and champagne at night completed a fruitful day. This life of indolent pleasure was made possible by an abundance of cheap female servants known as amas.
You had a baby ama who took care of children and to whom foreign children got very, very attached, because many of the foreign women really had very little contact with their children. Amas really brought up the children. Even prostitutes on the street, who were sort of part of the scenery of Shanghai, often walked around with their own ama.
For Shanghailanders, this city was an idyllic romp, a heaven on earth, but a heaven built on a hell of unremitting labor. From the rickshaw pullers to the coolies toiling on the waterfront, Shanghai ran on the sweat of the Chinese, whether they be men, women, or children.
My mother, the first job was working in the silk mill. Usually the silk mill employed 10 to 12-year-old girls. And later she told us the worst job, really worst job. Your fingers burning in the boiling water. And also you stood there all day long. And if you want to go to loo, you were not allowed to go. So quite a number of girls wet their pants.
The gap between the very rich and the very poor was brutally visible in this city. It made Shanghai an ideal breeding ground, not only for proselytizing reformers, but also for idealistic revolutionaries. The Christian missionary movement in China was centered here, and in 1921, a handful of left-wing radicals gathered in Shanghai and founded the Communist Party of China. But it was the success of the Communist Party of Russia that would have a more immediate impact on Shanghai. when thousands of foreign refugees showed up one day in the city's harbor.
The White Russians came to Shanghai en masse, as it were. Shanghai did not require passports, so anybody could go there who wanted to find asylum.
These were White Russians fleeing the Soviet Revolution of the Red Bolsheviks. Some 20,000 White Russians flooded the city. They brought with them Russian culture and an appetite for caviar and vodka and little else. Once well-to-do pillars of old Russia, the majority of White Russian men found it almost impossible to find work. And so it was up to their wives and daughters to make a living any way they could.
Many of them ended up in the entertainment industry, namely the vice industry, and were in fact women of great allure and beauty who set the style and replaced the other foreign prostitutes who were mainly Americans. And because they were so great in number, they did what no white woman would do then. They slept with Chinese. And this was to the consternation of racist whites. They were seen as traitors to the European mission.
The White Russians were unlike any foreigners the Chinese had ever seen. They were poor. The men took on menial jobs when they could find jobs.
They had to survive, and they were willing to do things that the Westerner wouldn't because it was beneath the white man.
With no money, low language, and nowhere else to escape, some turned to begging, others to drugs and alcohol.
They drank out of despair because the men were suddenly completely useless in every way. They could not make a living. They lost the feeling of, I don't want to say all, but certain. They served as bodyguards. They served as security men.
The lucky ones, those who worked as bodyguards, protected Shanghai's elite, and that included the Chinese elite, who had managed to grab a share of the foreigner's life of extravagance.
One of the most common crimes is kidnapping. It was, of course, the nightmare of the wealthy classes. And that's why bodyguards were so important. All those White Russians ended up carrying shotguns, standing around the gateways to these big mansions that the Shanghai elite had built.
And among the most prized targets was an enormously successful gold trader and banker who daily gambled a fortune before eating his breakfast.
My father was fearless. He can make $1 million in a day. And $1 million at that time, of course, is at least worth, 10 million today. And we used to keep about 3 cars. And in addition to the White Russian driver, we had another White Russian bodyguard. And my father used to carry a pistol, and he also had a bulletproof car.
With dozens of abductions occurring virtually every day, kidnapping had become big business in Shanghai, and home security called for big solutions.
My father got permission from the police department to mount machine guns on top of that house.
Just a few blocks away from the banker's heavily guarded mansion lived another high-risk target for kidnapping and assassination. This was China's legendary political leader and revolutionary hero, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. But when he chose his personal bodyguard, he didn't pick a White Russian. Instead, he hired an adventurer, a card shark, and a streetwise hustler by the name of Morris Cohen.
Cohen made his living in Canada on his wits. He was a con man, he played cards, he was a confidence man, he would sell fake gold rings. And after doing time in jail in Winnipeg, he ended up in Shanghai.
Once he'd unpacked his 8 guns from his luggage, Cohen went out to check the local scene.
He didn't go to the western area, which was very exciting and lots of lights and flags and stuff. He decided to go in the back streets, and he wanted to see the Chinese he knew in Canada. And he just spent hours roaming around these small, little, narrow, winding roads. and he just fell in love with the place, and he knew he wanted to stay.
Cohen's extraordinary journey began in a Russian shtetl, took him through Cockney London and Reform School, then the Canadian prairies, finally landing in China to become a bodyguard and aide-de-camp to Sun Yat-sen, the revered founder of the First Republic of China.
As one of Sun Yat-sen's main bodyguards, he followed Sun everywhere. And he was quite an intimidating character. He was this large, he wasn't a tall fellow, he was large and stocky, weighed 200-something pounds. And his nose had been broken many times in boxing matches and what have you. He wore one gun on his shoulder and the other one on his hip. And he would walk around town with these guns bulging, you know, just bulging out of his white suits. The Westerners noticed his two guns and started calling him Two-Gun Cohen, and the name stuck.
To have such a close relationship with the Chinese, let alone a Chinese political leader, was a rarity among foreigners in China. But this was Shanghai.
For Cohen, Shanghai was a perfect city. It was a wide open place. It had rules but didn't have rules at the same time. And this was a place where he could really carouse and have fun and gamble and see shady women if he wanted to and just really have a great time. It was a city with sort of no holds bar, almost made for him.
But Two-Gun Cohen could not save Sun Yat-sen from the cancer that killed him in 1925. His death left a power vacuum, and Shanghai became the prize to be taken by whatever side came out on top.
The left wing in the city, which was mainly dominated by the communists, carried out a series of strikes, taking over the Chinese portions of the city, throwing the good European citizens of the international settlement and the French concession into a state of near panic.
In that spring of 1927, it looked to the foreigners that the communists had taken over the city. Their life of colonial ease and dominance was suddenly in jeopardy. Their city of nightlife became a city of sandbags, barbed wire, and armed foreign military force. Adding to their anxiety was news that a Chinese army, led by a young general named Chiang Kai-shek, was marching up from the south. The foreigners' fear was that he had come to support the uprising and that he would launch a bloodbath against them.
When Chiang Kai-shek reached the outskirts of Shanghai, he inexplicably stopped and didn't move his soldiers in. Instead, he secretly entered the city and met with the gangster leaders of the city, Pak Mar Tuong and Big Ears Du. He cut himself a deal for $7 million from the bankers of Shanghai. They agreed that they would move against the left.
Early in the morning of April 12, 1927, the citizens of Shanghai were awakened by the sound of gunfire.
The gangsters under Big Ears Du attacked ferociously, shooting many on the spot, putting others into trucks and driving them out to execution grounds.
This alliance between Chiang Kai-shek and the gangsters of Shanghai took the left wing totally by surprise.
Thousands were killed. Anyone who was suspected to be a leftist, suspected to have any alliance with the communists, students were killed. It really was Du Yu-sun's crowning moment. He was the effective master of Shanghai. He was the puppet master.
This massacre convinced one communist leader that the revolution could never be won in the corrupt cities of China, but only out in the countryside. His name was Mao Zedong. For now, though, Mao was of no concern to the citizens of Shanghai. Life returned to normal, and the Shanghailanders returned to the thing they did best: make money. In the early 1930s, while most of the great cities in the world were beginning to suffer from the Great Depression, Shanghai was experiencing a building boom.
Shanghai changed constantly, and its impetus was attributable to an overwhelming desire by the population here to be modern, to be the cutting edge, to be better than any other place.
Those aspirations were shared by one of the wealthiest men in all of Asia, Sir Victor Sassoon. His dream was to turn Shanghai into a modern skyscraper city.
Victor Sassoon was a very wealthy Iraqi Jew who'd come to Shanghai and who just transformed the business of the city.
The name Sassoon was associated with Shanghai since the time they were one of the city's largest traders in opium. 4 generations later, Sir Victor Sassoon, with his proper British upbringing and posh hereditary title, came to Shanghai to enlarge the family fortune. This time, though, it would be through real estate. He decided to build the finest hotel in all the world and do it on the most expensive real estate in Asia, the corner of Nanking Road and the Bund. As soon as the doors of the Cathay Hotel opened, it started attracting the luminaries. Noel Coward was one of the first guests. He couldn't attend any of the inaugural parties because he had come down with the flu. Instead, he stayed in his hotel room and wrote Private Lives. A few floors above was the Cathay Ballroom, where Sir Victor threw some of the most lavish and outrageous parties Shanghai had ever seen.
He gave the most extraordinary parties, most of them fancy dress parties, for instance, the shipwreck party. And everyone had to come as if they'd just been caught as the boat went down. And you had one very adventurous couple who arrived stark naked except for a shower curtain wrapped round them and their hair sopping wet.
Besides real estate and raucous costume parties, Sir Victor's other great passions included a fondness for fast women and faster horses. That passion for the racetrack was shared by most of the Shanghailanders and the local Chinese.
Going to the races was a big event in Shanghai. And that was the social event for the international community, was to go to the races at the big racetrack. And the international settlement was the only place in the world where all kinds of nationalities lived together, Chinese and Europeans and North Americans. And the rest of the world may have been in depression. But Shanghai was just filled with jazz and galas and bazaars and theater and the kind of things that people in the rest of the world weren't enjoying during the Depression years.
The one thing that they did share with the rest of the world was an infatuation with the movies. And while the latest American films attracted large audiences, more people favored the locally made productions. Shanghai was the Hollywood of China, with a thriving film industry. As great as was Shanghai's love for the movies, it seemed it loved its automobiles even more. Not even the rainy season could stop the citizens of Shanghai from being chauffeured to any one of some 300 nightclubs, cabarets, and bars to dance the night away. And usually that dance was the tango.
The tango dancing was very sexy. The tango permitted you to do lots of things. You could be very close to each other. And I, for example, had a Spanish boyfriend whom, to my mother's horror, his name was Jesus. She said, couldn't you find somebody else with a different name, a Jewish girl? And he couldn't speak English, but who cared?
This devil-may-care attitude attracted not just conmen, rogues, and gamblers, but just about anyone with adventure in their heart. People like Emily Hahn, a free-spirited American reporter who had planned to stay only a few days before continuing on her journey to Africa.
As soon as she got off the little steamer, she said she never wanted to leave again. She just fell in love with it immediately. The humanity, the bustling, exciting life. Shortly after my mother arrived in Shanghai, she found an apartment in the red light district. It had been very notorious and was decorated as a bordello.
It didn't take long for the flamboyant cigar-smoking reporter to become the talk of the town.
She was walking by a pet store one day and she saw this gibbon and he was very, very beautiful. She had fallen in love with him, and she kept him for years, and he was like her baby.
She named him Mr. Mills, and the two of them became an inseparable couple on Shanghai's social scene.
And she would go everywhere with Mr. Mills draped around her, which was not so good news for men because Mr. Mills was incredibly jealous and bit any man that came near Emily.
I sometimes think she had fun shocking people. She never cared anything about what anybody said, at all, ever.
She was fascinated with the seamy side of life. She enjoyed rubbing shoulders with prostitutes. As a lark, one night, she got all tarted up and went to the brothel and didn't actually engage in any sex, but talked with customers, and she wrote about it.
News of this freewheeling single woman soon reached Shanghai's wealthiest bachelor, Sir Victor Sassoon. Shortly after their first introduction, Sir Victor invited Emily to his home. One of Sir Victor's hobbies was photography. He loved to take candid shots of the ladies of Shanghai. Emily Hahn, ever the exhibitionist, was only too happy to pose for him.
Emily Hahn and Sir Victor became lovers. She had many relationships in Shanghai. She was sexually liberated. It was why she was comfortable in Shanghai, because there weren't as many taboos sexually. There weren't as many social taboos.
But there was still one line that most Shanghailanders would never dare to cross.
In those days, the Chinese and the Europeans led fairly separate existences. And Emily went to one of those rare mixed parties. And there was this very beautiful Chinese there. He was from a very wealthy Chinese family. He was a poet and he was a publisher. Well, before the end of dinner, the two of them had just got up and left together and started a notorious affair.
She fell in love with Sin Mei. They were both artists. He was married, so she was like a, I don't know if concubine is the right word because she didn't depend on him financially, but apparently that was fine with Sin Mei's wife.
Sin Mei also introduced Emily Hahn to the big smoke, opium.
And then they asked my mother, would you like to try? And she said, absolutely, I want to try. She did it often, and it was very, very seductive that she could just forget about anything unpleasant and drift off, and life became very easy.
Emily Hahn slept with both Sir Victor and Sin Mei concurrently. And Sir Victor became jealous. In fact, dropped none too subtle hints at times that either a case of me or Sin Mei, so choose one or the other. Emily Hahn, of course, ignored him.
Opium addict, concubine, mistress, free spirit, but above all, Emily Hahn was a reporter, a regular contributor to the local press, as well as to the prestigious New Yorker magazine. And one of the biggest stories she would ever witness was about to break. In 1937, Japan was at war with China, and once again the sound of Japanese bombs could be heard across the city. A few years earlier, in a brief but deadly skirmish, Japanese forces, intent on taking over the Chinese section of Shanghai, had for the first time in history directed aerial bombardment upon civilians.
The biggest fire I ever saw in my life. The sky was bright red, you know. We were worried the fire might catch our houses. That's the worst part. I don't know how many people were killed.
And yet, throughout all the bombings and shellings, the Japanese were studiously careful not to touch either Frenchtown or the international settlement.
Foreign journalists, and Emily Hahn was no exception, sat in the Cathay Hotel, had drinks, and watched the Japanese gunboats in the harbor bombarding the Chinese area off behind. It was like a fireworks display.
The international concession and Frenchtown remained untouched until one steamy August Saturday, when inexperienced Chinese pilots accidentally launched bombs right into the very heart of Shanghai. The first bombs landed near Sir Victor Sassoon's beloved Cathay Hotel. Hundreds were killed or injured. Minutes later, another Chinese bomb struck Pak Mak Wong's notorious pleasure palace, the Great World, and thousands more died there.
That was a day which was described later as one of the worst civilian casualties in the world up to that time. Thousands of people were killed or injured, and my father was one of the members of the volunteer corps who had to go out and stack up the bodies like cordwood and get them out of the city.
By the end of that summer of 1937, a powerful Japanese army occupied all the Chinese sections of the city, turning the international settlement and French town into islands of refuge. Outside their borders was a lawless hell on earth where abductions, torture, and death became commonplace. This part of Shanghai became known as the Badlands.
Badlands, of course, calls up to mind the Badlands of the American West when anything went. And that's exactly what happened in the Badlands. All of the rules and regulations that had governed urban gambling, prostitution, even the drug trade in the French concession or in the international settlement went by the board.
Shanghailanders who for so long were accustomed to wielding power and expecting respect and deference were now experiencing something entirely different.
I remember the barbed wire at the end of the street and the Japanese soldiers that were always present. And the Japanese soldiers used to train their machine guns on we twins as we played in our yard. It was very unsettling for my mother to see the Japanese soldiers with the machine guns on we kids.
Soon the Shanghailander women and children were told to leave their beleaguered city.
And I still remember standing in my bedroom, and my mother had said we could take one treasure, one only. And I was torn between my flower girl basket or my teddy bear. And after a great deal of indecision, I took the teddy bear. And that was our last day in Shanghai.
There was more than a touch of irony that as some Shanghailanders began to say their last goodbyes, another group of refugees was about to flood the city. They were European Jews escaping Hitler to one of the only places in the world that was open to them. Shanghai still didn't care about such official niceties as passports or visas. But the Shanghai which had managed not only to survive, but flourish in this uneasy mix of Chinese and foreigners, of corruption and religious rectitude, of poets and revolutionaries, that Shanghai was coming to an end. But it left an indelible mark. For the Chinese, Shanghai, bursting with creative energy and political ferment, was a crucible of change. For the Shanghailanders, life in the 20s and 30s, in this the most cosmopolitan place on earth, became the stuff of legend, a crazy free-for-all in a sin city called Shanghai.